Kantipur Conclave.
To begin with the very first session of Day 2 of Kantipur Conclave with the theme Towards 2030. They say optimism is the faith that leads to achievement even when things are not moving in the direction or at the pace that they should be moving. Nepalese, I think, have been very patient and hopeful towards the possibilities of a better tomorrow. And now with the changes that are happening, it's important to look at the kind of comprehensive and balanced approach that needs to be taken to ensure a sustainable long-term growth and progress, and hence the theme Towards 2030. To moderate this session, we have Mr. Amish Mulmi, who is a writer and editor based out of New Delhi. He also writes for the Kathmandu Post and has very interesting columns which are from his travels within Nepal, and in which he introduces Nepal from a very fresh new perspective with a new pair of lenses. So before we start the session, I'd like to remind that we have to incorporate the question and answer within those 60 minutes. And to all of you who are here as participants, I would like to request you to kindly send in your questions through the Kantipur Conclave app so that our moderator can incorporate those questions at the end of the session. So without any further delay, I'd now like to request Mr. Amish Mulmi to kindly carry forward with the session.
Thank you, Sadiksha. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this chilly morning, for taking your time out. I'm very proud to be moderating this session with some eminent panelists here. When we say towards 2030, we've had a vision of a middle-income status. We know that Nepal is growing. There is a lot of optimism. There's a lot of growth happening. We've seen some remarkable reductions in poverty. We've seen a relatively low unemployment rate as well within the country. There's a strong female labor force participation. And we are 27th among developing countries in the Inclusive Development Index, which basically puts us ahead of several BRICS countries, such as Brazil, India, and South Africa. We've met most MDGs or ahead of schedule, but we have some concerns. One of the highest remittances to GDP ratio in South Asia, second highest in the world. And during the last 45 years, we've averaged about 4% on per annum. This is changing in the recent years. We are seeing growths of about 7%, 6 to 7% on average in the last 2 to 3 years. At this trend rate of growth, per capita income, according to the World Bank, will reach $958 by 2030. The low middle income threshold is $1,025. However, we've just had conversations yesterday. Most likely, we will meet those targets. We've met 2 out of 3 thresholds already. This session, what we will do is, because of our panelists, we will talk about diverse ideas about Nepal in 2030, going beyond middle income. We'll also talk about foreign policy. We'll talk about sustainable development, climate change. How do we face these challenges? To begin with, I'll begin with introducing my panelists. We have Dr. Xavier, Constantino Xavier, who is a fellow in foreign policy at Brookings, India, based in New Delhi. We have Dr. Song, who is a regional economic advisor for the Asian Development Bank. We have Songqiao, who's the founder of WildBound, an innovative environmental education venture based in China that brings young adults on expeditions.
Aspiration of Nepal towards 2030. But middle-income countries, this concept is very widely defined. And the minimum is around, I think the moderator has already said, it's about $1,000 defined by the World Bank ADB. We used this as a benchmark to decide whether you would be access to the concessional window or the ordinary window. But for Nepal, I believe to reach middle-income country is just in the next few years. Yeah, now it's already $800 in 2017, and in 2018 you might already close to $900 per capita in terms of gross national income. And then towards 2030, I believe it should be very close to the target which Swarnim set in Vision in 2030 when you were vice chair of the National Planning Commission. So to reach middle-income country is not a major issue, I believe, for Nepal. Although Nepal, you have to compare with other countries, very similar countries, like Laos in Southeast Asia. Actually, Laos was in a very similar per capita income level with Nepal in 2000. But now Laos is almost double the national income level of Nepal. Then Cambodia is also very similar in 2000, but in 2017-18, now Cambodia is a little bit ahead of Nepal. So you have to compare with yourself with other peers. But this is economic transformation. Actually, economic transformation is a small part of a big transition you have. And you are embarking two major transitions. One is economic transformation. The other one is actually the constitutional transition. So this is federalism. You have to make federalism work, and the constitutional transition is not easy. And if you look at the history, you look at France. France took 100 years to finish that transition. America, United States took 2 wars, Independence War and the Civil War, to finish that constitution transition. And the constitutional transition can regress if there's no safeguard. If citizens don't safeguard that transition, then it could regress. So yesterday we have already heard the youth session, and they are very optimistic. Yes, I really admire their optimism. And also, I'm also very optimistic to Nepal's transition. And your constitutional transition has already gone quite a few years, actually. If you count the difficulties, struggles in the past 20 years, you would say that's part of the constitutional transition. And with constitutional transition, if you reach the constitution orders, I believe that would guarantee Nepal to reach a developed country. So that would be the, I believe it would be the goal for 2030, and you should put Nepal on the path to the success constitutional transition and to make federalism work. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Song. As Dr. Song said, it requires not just an economic transformation, but also transformation in other areas. One of these areas that we are seeing massive transformations is in our foreign policy. We're seeing increasing interactions with China at 3 levels. We're seeing government-to-government interactions, we've seen private sector investments, and we've seen people-to-people contacts. However, our southern neighbor with India, we've mostly had government-to-government contact. The private sector, we've barely had any contact with the private sector in India. What I want to ask Dr. Constantino is, how can Nepal leverage its geographic position to take advantage of the growth rates of the 2 neighbors? And with India specifically, can we take the conversation away from politics and security and direct it towards economic growth? And I'll add a third to that. Can India also take the lead in regional connectivity? Because South Asia is one of the least connected regions in the world, despite being so culturally similar. Can India do that?
Thanks, Amish. Hello? Hearing me? Yeah. Thanks, Amish. Hello to everyone. Good morning. I mean, thank you for having me here, and I think congratulations to Kantipur and the organization and the many people behind this, because we all used to take trips around the world and talk about Nepal. In Delhi, in Beijing, in the US, in Europe, and I certainly do that a lot. But it's really refreshing to come to Kathmandu and discuss the world here in Kathmandu. And I think this is really an important contribution to start, shifting tables a bit, and instead of Nepal becoming a little object thrown around, a little piece between a big geopolitical, geoeconomic chess, we actually have a more greater agency here in Kathmandu to talk about the world and very important issues which are going to affect Nepal in the future. I mean, your question on connectivity, I think the last one is the most important one, and I'll come to India within that. We've seen what happened between India and Pakistan over the last few days, and is going to happen. Tragedy which is based in the partition of 1947, the subcontinent between India and Pakistan. But we always talk about partition between India and Pakistan, but actually what happened in this region is a fundamental economic partition, social partition, cultural partition among several countries. So it's a paradox that in the 1950s, this region was more integrated in absolute terms, not in relative terms. It was easier to cross borders. It was easier to move capital, to move ideas, to move people around this region than today. That's the paradox we are in. So the whole world became more interdependent since the 1950s. The whole world is more connected, and South Asia has become more disconnected within and more isolated from the rest of the world. And that has started to change from the 1990s, in particular because India started to open up its economy, and several countries around it too since the 1990s. And that has completely shifted, therefore, the mindset, I think, of several actors who are dealing with the neighborhood. Now, this poses a challenge because traditionally you looked at the region through the prism of politics and security, and India played an important role in that and was always very worried about any other powers in this region. And now you're putting the emphasis on connectivity, interdependence, proximity with other countries. And the challenge is huge. The World Bank just came out with a report late last year saying that the actual cost of this partition of non-trade barriers and political barriers to trade in South Asia is around $6 billion in total, of which 3 billion are just India, Pakistan, if they had actually an open economic, relationship and political, based on a good political relationship. And I can think of many other such partitions affecting South Asia today. If you look at the region of Humla here in Nepal, wonderful work now coming up on how Humla was deeply connected with Tibet and China as an economic corridor connecting the Tibetan plateau and the rest of China to the Bay of Bengal. The whole Himalayan region, therefore, was always a transition area, a belt between the northern Tibetan, Chinese hinterland, if you want, and the Indian Ocean region. And I think that's upon us now to reconnect that region. And there will be challenges, like you said. I think it's an adjustment for many people. It's an adjustment also for Nepal, which I think now has a stable government, a strong government which is committed to a strong foreign policy. It needs to, instead of just looking at India, which was generally the only place you could look at, now you have China coming in. You have many other countries. We saw the debates about the Indo-Pacific happening over the last months here in Kathmandu, very heated debates. But I'd say the more the merrier for Nepal. The tradition of Nepal's foreign policy has always been one of diversification, of what's called Nepalese non-alignment, which means that you don't want to depend on a single country. You don't want to depend only on India, nor do you want to depend only on China or on India and China. You want to have the Japanese investing here. You want to have connectivity with Southeast Asia, an economic growth area in Asia. You want to have the Europeans supporting the development of Nepal, and they have done that very well over the last years. And you have the Americans too. So I think that tradition of which King Mahendra in the 1960s used to call dynamic neutralism, which is not exactly sort of complete neutralism, but means sort of you're going to adjust and play around the game of balancing all countries and bringing them in actively into Nepal, is the most productive way for Nepal until 2030.
Thank you, Dr. Xavier. When we talk about reforms in Nepal, it's not that we've not had a history of reforms. Between 1986 and 1996, we've had growth rates averaging 5%, which have been the highest historically. We've had, even now, one of the largest sectors where we've seen improvements is in digital connectivity in telecommunications. In fact, by 2025, compared to its neighboring countries, the penetration of internet and mobile connections are predicted to be much higher in Nepal. We will have about 124% mobile connection penetration by 2025, while India's mobile connection will be 98%. I want to go back and ask Dr. Wagle, how has Nepal achieved this? How has Nepal been able to achieve significant economic revolutions in certain sectors while lagging behind in, let's say, infrastructure or capital investment? Does it require a thinking beyond existing models?
Thank you. I think Dr. Lohani is here, so it's apt that you refer to the economic reforms starting in the mid-80s. I think he initiated some of those reforms, especially in the banking sector, where Nepal is doing reasonably well. That burst of early reforms in the 80s, propelled by some sort of an economic crisis, was continued after the big political change in 1990. The tragedy with Nepal has been that we've not been able to sustain that, right? So after the mid-90s, late 90s, that sort of petered out. And we know why. The conflict intervened, a lot of instability, Palace massacre, a lot of external factors came into play. But you are right that in certain sectors we've managed to see the country leapfrog. That is partly because of an openness, policy openness, and a dynamism of a select policy reformers and leaders, but also the technology was on our side. So in 1991, the entire country of Nepal had just 71,560 telephone lines, landlines. What happened after that? Well, mobile telephony became much more affordable. The technology aided us, but it's not enough just to have the technology out there, right? You need that receptivity. You need that willingness to really engage with the rest of the world. I mean, North Korea had a similar choice, but it didn't make that choice, right? So today, you're right, I think 30 million cell phone subscriptions exist, 20 million active users according to the Nepal Telecom Authority. So that leapfrogging has been possible because of both internal and external circumstances that have been in our favor. On the other hand, the deeper reforms that we expect in other sectors, that needs a lot of complementarity, right? It's not enough for individual champions to emerge. So Kulman Gising was able to get many things done in the electricity sector, but to get the entire economy moving, growing on a healthy 7, 8, 9% per annum on a sustained basis for another 12, 15 years, you need many factors to be aligned. And that's where the challenge is. That's where we need political stability, a larger visioning on the part of the leadership, the private sector to also toe the line. So a lot of things need to be aligned, as I said. The stars need to be aligned. And leading up to 2030, there are 3 or 4 big changes that we need to anticipate, right? It is very likely that Nepal will begin to age before becoming rich. That's a profound shift. That's a big thing that we need to internalize. Beginning 2028, we will become an aging society. We will have another 25, 26 years before we become aged. So there's a narrow window of 25, 26 years. But many countries that mimic or replicate this kind of a demographic profile are already richer. So Indonesia comes to mind, which will also enter its phase of aging around the same time as Nepal, leading up to 2030. But it's already 5 times richer than us. Other countries, Malaysia, Japan, which did this rapid transformation from an aging to an aged society, did at much higher levels of income. The second profound shift that we need to prepare for is we'll most likely urbanize before having meaningfully industrialized. So the share of manufacturing, which is a subset of industry, just 6%. Now let's assume that things go very well and the sectors that Nepal has a comparative advantage, we really scale up. And go up to 12% of GDP in manufacturing. That's still not enough to create the kind of jobs to match the young demographic profile that we will face. The third big shift that I think we need to really prepare for is going forward, Nepal's policy space will be constricted much more by the unknown disruptive technologies in the energy sector, for example, and in manufacturing, the automation, the AI and all that, than the known processes of catch-up and the advantage of backwardness. So, we try to look at how countries prospered in the 20th century. It's not going to be terribly helpful going forward. So we need to prepare for those uncertainties, the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns, as one defense secretary memorably put it. So a lot of things going ahead, but I'll come to those later.
I'll move to Songqiao. We've had a very interesting discussion in the past couple of years about sustainable development in Nepal. I mean, the best example I could give is of Nijgarh Airport, where there is a growing sort of discourse going around how many trees are going to be cut for the airport. These, as Nepal progresses, as there are more infrastructure projects that will continue to happen in Nepal, these debates will continue to come up. What I want to ask Songqiao is sustainable development a misnomer? I mean, Should a low-income country like Nepal, where growth is essential, but we'll have to exploit our natural resources, what should it do? What sort of experiences can you tell us from, let's say, China, or let's say other countries around the world? What do you think?
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. It's a great honor to be here and incredible opportunity for me to learn so much about Nepal and to be here with all of you at the conclave. I think we've touched on some really interesting points, and today we're talking about 2030, about the future, which is one of my favorite topics, because it's so unknown and because there's so much uncertainty, as was just mentioned by my panelists. So they're saying that the future is already here, but it's unevenly distributed, right? When we talk about sustainable development and looking at 2030, which is only 10 years down the road, by the way, and we're talking about sustainability in 2019, not in 1999 or even earlier. So I don't think there needs to be more debate about whether sustainability is possible. It's a requirement and it's imperative that all of our growth has to be green and we have to be resilient. Yesterday in the keynote speeches and the youth panel, we talk about Nepal being a very resilient society. We have gone through political transformation. We are going through these economic and social transitions, and the environmental transformation and having this relationship between human and nature, how to actually utilize natural resources for economic growth, but also sustainable economic growth. I think it's really what Nepal is going to teach other countries. So when China has developed 30 years ago, we have pretty much sacrificed a lot of our ecosystems to trade for economic growth. And we all know right now what the situation is like, and China has shown that if you have the willpower, you can clean up pretty quickly with air pollution, with food safety, and the Chinese policy right now on ecological civilization is trying to address those roles. But I think, as was mentioned with leapfrogging technologies, Nepal doesn't have to go through the same way of development before conservation. I think these two things can really go hand in hand. And in terms of climate change, which is really going to be a defining characteristic of our age right now and of the next 10 years of growth, all of the natural disasters that we're seeing these days, whether it's forest fire, it's droughts or flooding, will all be exacerbated by climate change. So in all kinds of policy, we must take this into account because we're tackling these so-called wicked problems, right? And we don't know what's gonna help and what isn't. And an earthquake or a natural disaster, it's not about whether it will happen, it's about when it will happen and whether we can be prepared when such a thing happens. So all the rubrics of society, whether it's economic growth, whether it's social resilience, whether it's community resilience, has to be taken these issues into account. So as we're thinking about this uncertainty in the future, and I think there's a few sectors in Nepal that really should address environmental issues. First of all, agriculture and forestry. And forestry is what Nepal is already doing quite well. And because Nepal doesn't have a huge greenhouse emission, adaptation and being able to account for carbon emission of other countries, there has been some good examples around that. In terms of infrastructure and energy, of course, Nepal is going to advance greatly in the next 10 years for it to achieve middle income status. But because of the diverse in opinion, because of the debate that's allowed to happen in public spaces, we might be able to avoid some of the consequences we have seen in other places, the social impact, the environmental cost of big infrastructure projects, as you just mentioned. And thirdly, tourism. And we all know that the mountains of Nepal, the huge diversity of flora and fauna, and the different ecosystems is a great attraction to people all over the world. But how do we develop responsible and sustainable tourism without compromising the social and environment? I think those are really interesting areas to explore. And personally, in the next few years, I might be bringing students and business leaders and Chinese philanthropists to learn from the cases in Nepal and how do we tackle these issues of sustainable development and climate change. So very excited to be here and be in this conversation.
Thank you, Songqiao. I'd just like to remind the audience that all questions need to be posted on the app. Please keep them short. Please also tell us who you want the question to be answered by. or if there are two panelists that you would like the questions to be directed to, please mention that as well. I'd like to bring the topic back to economics. The whole talk about middle income status becoming richer, we forget one idea, which is income inequalities. A recent report told us the income of the richest 10% of Nepalese is more than 3 times that of the poorest 40%. We have one of the highest Gini coefficients, which measures income inequalities in the world. We have urban incomes are consistently more than twice that of rural incomes. We have gender, land, ethnic inequalities still happening. What I want to ask Dr. Song is that we've spoken about these structural changes. How do you think Nepal can address these dual challenges of having economic growth while addressing income inequalities? Do you think that solving or wealth redistribution requires a new idea like UBI, like a universal basic income, something that Finland has tried, something that India wants to try out in this budget? There is a new policy for farmers. Do you think Nepal needs to move towards a universal basic income to resolve income inequalities?
This is a very big question. So actually, power imbalance and structural inequalities underlie the transition of the constitution in Nepal to the federation. I believe actually this is the underlying reason why Nepal chose the federation. And if you can make federalism work, in my view, then you can address power imbalance and inequalities very much, because the federations given the power to the provinces and the local governments, and they can take care of their citizens in their geographic areas. And then, in terms of this universal basic income, you already see some modified version of this universal basic income in the interim budget. India just released at the beginning of this month. And they give 6,000 rupees to the farmers with only less than 2 acres of land. So it's some sort of basic income support to the poor families. But universal basic income, actually, the idea came from developed countries, Finland. And universal basic income could be quite costly, because if you want to be meaningful, then you have to give quite a decent amount to lift the people, the household out of the poverty. And also you might encounter moral hazard problems. And for Nepal, at this stage of development, my personal view is you need mobilized resources, because the resources are very limited. Government resources are quite limited. And then you have to balance whether you want to use that resources to redistribute from the rich to the poor, or you use these resources for the development of the country, to invest in, say, infrastructure, to invest in the state. Because you want the state to be effective, then you have to invest in state capacity. Yeah, we always talk about Nepal is very slow to implement projects. Yeah, ADB has also got some responsibility. We initiated this Malanchi water supply project. It's already almost 20 years. It's still not completed. So the state itself is not so effective. But the state itself doesn't have the capacity. And you need to have a consensus to see whether the people, the public, wants the investment in the state capacity in order for the state to have the effectiveness to implement project, to protect every individual's rights. So that's a balance. I think that would be the people's choice, whether they like redistribution or you like some investment, more investment, mobilize resources to invest in the state. And then sometimes for India, because you're a big neighbor here, and some people call India's development model is a precocious development model. It's much too much. And then they pay the cost of democracy. Because democracy, you have to redistribute wealth, and economic growth probably, as a result, would suffer. So there's many issues. But I believe, actually, if you make federalism work, then inequality issues would go away, because the federalism basically is to tackle inequality. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Song. I want to come back to Constantino. Humla was a very interesting case study that you brought up, because I had recently there last year, and we discussed the idea of trade and how locals are adapting to this idea of inter-country trade and conducting business in China. We're also talking about a train coming from China to Kathmandu. We're talking from a train coming from India to Kathmandu. You've just mentioned that we've historically been a sort of a transit point between India and Tibet, or India and China. Do you think that sort of situation where Nepal becomes a transit state between India and China is possible within the current dimensions of the Sino-Indian relationship? Do you think that Nepal can emerge as a hub, as what Xi Jinping's 2+1 proposal was? Do you think there is enough sort of foreign policy or political will in the both countries and within the current dimensions for that to occur?
Yes, but I think, transit state sounds very, again, subject. Nepal becomes sort of this route through which you circulate, and Indian capital goes up and Chinese laborers come down, or investment. It shouldn't be transit state. You should be a pivot state. Nepal's been a pivot state. Nepal's been the center of an economy in the largest sense for several centuries. And it must reconstitute that role as an actual sort of pivot state which has relationships with, forget countries, with different regions, Himalayan regions. Sujeev speaks about East-South Asia, with the region northeast of India, with Sikkim, with Bangladesh, towards Myanmar. So we have to go beyond these sort of nationalisms of borders and see Nepal as a larger integrated economy into this wider region, whether it's South Asia, East-South Asia, the Chinese hinterland, Tibet, China, Central Asia, the Bay of Bengal, the Indian Ocean region. That is the natural space which Nepal has actually occupied from the 18th century onwards and before, and needs to recover. And therefore, instead of 2+1, it should be 1+2. I mean, let's put the emphasis on Nepal. It's important that Nepal starts articulating this policy. And I go back to the first democratically elected prime minister of this country, B.P. Koirala, who had a policy called, his foreign policy was open doors policy. And he saw the benefits of diversifying relations and allowing Nepal to have its own proper, independent relations with all these countries. Leads me to another issue, which, I mean, Dr. Song spoke about the importance of federalism, political transition. You spoke about the importance of a public debate about environment and stakeholders in that issue. And then you mentioned this cost of democracy. And I think that's something which needs to be discussed quite openly, which is it really a cost? Is it a cost in the short term or in the long term? Is it a benefit? I think there's a fundamental relation, I think, which we've seen over humanity between economic development and political institutions. In particular, political institutions that are open, diverse, and transparent, accountable to the people. That's called democracy. That's called pluralism in terms of institutions. And Nepal has gone through so much pain over the last decades. I mean, absolutism in terms of royal autocracy, two pro-democracy movements, a devastating civil war, one of the most unstable governments, constantly changing in the 1990s, constitutional instability the last years, and it's extremely important to build the institutions that are open, transparent, accountable, democratically elected, because I think that will be actually a benefit and not a cost. It will benefit in the long term for Nepal to grow more sustainably. And obviously, these are tensions. The jury's out, and we have two fundamentally different models, the Chinese and the Indian model. And we have our preferences, personal or not. We have a different scholarly assessments of which model is going to be prevailing. A centralized state-led model in which if you're a citizen, you have no access to your data, private data, for example, in China. Or one in India where the data privacy issues is being discussed, debated, going to Supreme Court, being fought out, the government brings it out without a law, the Aadhaar system, for example, now is having an issue. So these are two very different systems, and I think we're all, I think in this day and age, we're all tending towards immediatism, growth, and that makes sense. Nepal is growing very quickly, people want now. They don't want to wait for tomorrow. But at the same time, I caution to the importance of moderation in political institutions, which I think in the long term will prevail. So it's up on us to, I think, explain that, whether it's the Nepalese government, whether it's scholars in us here, to explain to people and say, you know, you want to have your food on the table now, but the way you get it is going to fundamentally constrain your choices in the future.
That's a very interesting point you raised about how do you get the food on your table. I mean, in Nepal today, we're seeing high growth rates, but the paradox is a lot of our growth rate is being fueled by remittance incomes. We know that about 4 million people in Nepal, out of a workforce of 14 million, are working abroad. Despite this, we have low unemployment rates simply because a lot of people are working abroad. The unemployment rate within the country is about 35.8%. What I want to ask Dr. Wagle is, the Prime Minister has recently started a new employment scheme intended to halt this labor migration. What sort of targets do you think this employment scheme can achieve, number one? Number two, do you think there are some priority sectors where the labor can be directed to within the country rather than going abroad?
On the Prime Minister's employment program, I think it's a misnomer. It's not an employment creating or employment generating program. And I've told the Minister of Labor twice to please set the expectations correctly. If he's announcing that I'm going to create jobs for every working adult in the country, and then 6 months or 12 months down the road that is not going to be realized, we're going to have lots of protests on the streets. So I've told this to some of the leaders. It's actually a social protection program that is born out of a commitment that we made in the Constitution. We've very ambitiously said we're going to honor the right to work, right? So it's in that spirit that this particular piece of legislation was introduced. In India, you're familiar with this, the Mahatma Gandhi National Employment Guarantee Scheme. There in the act itself, this is to provide jobs for willing and able working adults for at least up to 100 days in a year for unskilled manual work, right? So something similar is what is being sought to be replicated here. So of all the available working adults, people who are willing, or the state offers them work which is unskilled and manual in nature, if the state cannot guarantee that jobs to people from households who don't have any other working adult working, or who don't have anyone working overseas. So the criteria, the filter is extremely extensive. So it's going to be a miracle just to come out of this, this whole laundry list of eligibility. Then, if the state offers you the work that you're not interested, then you don't qualify. So let's say you are willing to work in this manual unskilled work, but the state was unable to provide. Then they will give you 50% of the minimum wage that you would have got had you been fully employed for 100 days. So it's a very restrictive, very modest social protection program. I don't see this as creating jobs and halting this epic outflow of adults leaving the country. Nonetheless, from a social protection point of view, this is a welcome initiative that is perfectly aligned with what we've written in the Constitution. The larger and the more substantive initiative has to come from the economic momentum that we generate elsewhere in the economy. There is no substitute to creating jobs in the private sector. I mean, you're right, 16 million of the 16 million working adults, probably 1 million are in full-time education. Probably 5 to 6 million at least are working overseas. Of those that remain, you look at the official statistics and it's really depressing. 500,000 come into the labor force every year. Last year, Lok Seva Ayog, the Public Service Commission, created 9,500 jobs out of close to 1 million applicants, right? And there was Sikshit Bhatta here yesterday telling that Tutal, this ride-sharing venture that he has started here, created 10,000 jobs. So more than Lok Seva Ayog, because in Nepal, Jagir means Lok Seva Jagir, right? So jobs aren't going to come from that sector. You look at the economic survey, I think last year, the latest data we have, 509 firms were registered, pledging to create about 26,500 jobs. So do the maths, 10,000 from the public sector, 26,000 from the private sector, 500,000 coming into the labor force. Just do the maths, right? Let's assume 200,000 are self-employed or underemployed in self-created businesses or in the agriculture sector. So there's a massive gap, right? And these social protection programs are not the answer. They are necessary, but they are not sufficient. So I go back to the point that, and this is globally a stylized fact, 8 to 9 out of 10 jobs come from the private sector. So unless we get the economy growing at 8, 9, 10% per annum on a sustained basis, we're not going to create jobs in large numbers. And even after that, even the nature of growth will need to be probed. Is it coming from automation? Is it coming from the highly specialized services sectors? Or is it being driven from sectors or driven by sectors which are growth, sort of labor, which use labor in large quantities? And their economists use this concept called, what is the employment elasticity of growth? For every 1% of growth, what percentage of employment creation are we making? And there, I think Nepal is reasonably placed in the sense that our long-term advantages will come from sectors like agriculture, commercial but higher productive agriculture, tourism, niche manufacturing, which has the potential to create jobs, modern tradable services, infrastructure. There's a massive gap in infrastructure that we need to fill over the next 15, 20 years. All of these sectors, if done right, with the right set of incentives in place, can create jobs in large numbers. So from that perspective, we're better placed than other countries, which are having to rely on job-creating modes that may not actually be much more very friendly to job creation going forward, given the kind of disruption that we anticipate in many of these traditional sectors.
Thank you, Dr. Wagle. We know that there will be a lot of dynamism in the Nepali economy in the years to come. I want to come back to Songqiao and talk about, again, sustainable development in a time of climate change. A recent Yale study told us a third of the ice in the Himalayas will melt by 2100. What I want to ask Songqiao is, how can the state work with communities to resolve this issue? Can the private sector do things to negate the challenges, a global challenge like climate change? How does a low-income country like Nepal do that?
Thanks for the question. And I think it's super important to talk about that because Nepal is prone to natural disasters. And as you mentioned, the glacier melt is a real issue. And personally, I've spent time in the Arctic and Antarctica and witnessed that both poles, along with the Himalayas, are the most heavily affected by climate change. And there are some estimates that by 2030, the temperature increase in Nepal could vary between 0.5 degrees, which is the best case scenario, to 2 degrees, which is more than the global average. And all of the disasters that might happen around this region have a real impact on human beings and local livelihood. And the fact is that modeling these behaviors, modeling glacier lake outbursts, modeling earthquakes, modeling flooding and droughts and forest fires are really difficult. And partially because we don't have the database. We don't have the data, we don't know, we don't have enough collection points and monitoring stations. So simply, some of the disasters like landslide or flooding could happen within minutes of us knowing or within hours of us knowing. So how do we respond to that? And for some of the slower natural hazards like droughts, that has a direct impact on food security, on whether the local communities can actually support themselves. And these are a little bit of a long-term process to model. So all of these things are inherently difficult processes. So the basic infrastructure to put in place by the government, by the state, of data, of monitoring, of early warning system has to happen. And the private sector play a big role in this. You have mentioned the advancement in telecommunication, in ICT. We have a panel on ICT later, and how do you actually combine these technology with state implemented measures to actually deal with the, natural hazards and deal with response. And I want to come back to the idea of resilience, like what does it mean to actually have a resilient community? And economic growth is very important, a diverse livelihood. And we all know in the villages, for a local household to survive, you cannot just only depend on one economic means. And that's just going to happen in a lot of communities. They'll have to have agroforestry. They might work seasonally in tourism jobs, and they might have connections. They might get into niche production of certain goods. So all of these diversified means of production needs to happen. So I see there's definitely a big role from the state and the private sector, but also a lot of grassroots-led and bottom-up approaches. And actually, on my trips to Nepal, I've met quite a few young entrepreneurs who are in sustainable development who have really taken up measures in their own community to start agroforestry projects, to start community-based programs in tourism, or to integrate development across the board on different levels and involving different members of the community. And I think that really adds to the resilience. And along with what was mentioned before about Nepal being at the center, at the hub of economic activities of the sub-region, I think it could be a confluence. It is where great rivers originate from. It is where the glaciers and this great reserve of fresh water we have, but also diverse faith systems, diverse values, and to be able to have that diversity and hold that diversity is a crucial means of resilience that we can rely on in this uncertain future.
Thank you, Songqiao. On that note, Dr. Wagle, I just want to ask you from your experience in government, do you think that our policymakers are sort of thinking along these lines of what Songqiao mentioned, of community development, of bottom-up approach, of working with the private sector to negate these sort of challenges? What do you think?
On community-led initiatives, actually, Nepal has a lot to celebrate. We're actually a great example of, Elinor Ostrom got a prize for Nobel Prize for researching how community-led irrigation systems resolve disputes and serve the villages very well. Community forestry, community radios, these are all initiatives that we've talked about, and homegrown Nepali-led initiatives. So that can be scaled up and applied to new sectors, especially in the environmental arenas. Policymakers in government are generally very conservative and traditional, so there's a lag time before they catch up with what's going on around them. Having said that, again, like with the economic reforms that you started with, it just takes a few very open-minded and reform-oriented leaders and policymakers and bureaucrats often to lead the way. And even on environment, I think EC Mode is based here in Kathmandu. It's headquartered here in Kathmandu. The vice chairman of the National Planning Commission actually sits on the board. We take a very active interest in what they do. So the report that they issued 2 weeks ago, that confirming what many of us feared, that 1/3 of the ice will go away by 2100 even if we cap average global temperatures to about 1.5 degrees Celsius to pre-industrial levels, under the assumption that the Himalayas, the higher altitudes actually warm even faster, right? So there's actually a more scary prediction of almost 2/3 of the ice disappearing by 2100. That's going to have a lot of impact on the big dream that we're building around hydroelectricity generation, the big dream that we're building around an agricultural, a green revolution that we've never had, but with Behri Babai and Sikta and Rani Zamaria, all this big irrigation coming, being built, and the leapfrogging that we'll make in agriculture. Tourism, the big dream that we're building around tourism, all have implications. So I think the sooner that we internalize some of these existential problems that are in our midst. But I think I'm quite optimistic that faced with a crisis, Nepalis do tend to, but we do, with federalism, there's also a greater space that's now been given to homegrown, community-led, very local initiatives. But some of these big problems need a macro solution at the national level, the regional level. The problem of black carbon, for example, needs absolute cooperation with our South Asian neighbors, most notably India. Many of the minor issues can be solved locally, as our constitution envisions.
Thank you, Dr. Wagle. I'll open the floor to questions. We have 3 questions. 2 of them are similar. I'll begin with Srijan Bhandari's question. He asks, capital formation is low in Nepal. Many of the countries are seen to be developed when manufacturing sector helps into export products and services. Our main export is human resources, and sooner or later they will return to Nepal, which eventually means the unemployment has not reduced but transferred to other countries. How can we absorb such people, generate capital, and improve productivity? I think, Dr. Song, would you like to take this question? How do you improve capital investment in Nepal?
Yeah, I think you need to mobilize the domestic resources. But more importantly, actually, Dr. Wagle has already mentioned, yeah, you need to have economic freedom. You have to empower people. I think we have several sessions about this. So the private sector, and for Nepal, it's even more important. At this stage of development, the market is not so prevalent, and you need to create markets for many sectors, and to let the private sector to work, and let people to work themselves out. What are the comparative advantages? Comparative advantages actually come from a free market. Without a free market, people cannot find where is profitable and where the comparative advantage of Nepal has. And Nepal has a very huge endowment of environment. And I think Songqiao has already mentioned that this environment and the climate change issues are very real, and Nepal needs to protect this environment. Then probably natural resources will become a huge endowment and in the future. And then I think you probably also need to think some big ideas. Say, many countries already proposed no fossil fuel vehicles by 2030. For Nepal, you have such endowment of natural resources. Environment is your key resources. And do you have this idea of no fossil fuel vehicles even before many countries by 2025? Or how about zero carbon emissions by a certain stage? Because Nepal has to think about all these issues. Then I think private investors would be utilized. As long as they have the freedom of the economic freedom as the open market, then probably they will find their niche to invest, to make money, and to prosper.
Thank you, Dr. Song. We have two similar questions to Dr. Wagle. Sandeep Babu Paudel asks, what are the bottlenecks in government in implementation of set policies? While Naresh Mishra asks, how receptive is the government for projects aligning with achievement of, I believe, MDG goals? So I think both of them want to ask, how receptive is the government towards achieving MDG goals? Are there any bottlenecks in achieving these policies?
You probably meant SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. On the MDGs, again, we've done reasonably well, partly because the goals were less ambitious, very basic in nature, and we started from a very low base. So Nepal was able to meet almost all of the MDGs. Now, when we scaled from the MDGs to the SDGs, the level of ambition has grown. MDGs were largely a government-led effort. SDGs need the entire country to rally behind these goals. When I was the vice chairman of the Planning Commission, we brought out a roadmap for SDGs from 2016 to 2030. We estimated then that we would need about $18 billion, close to $18 billion per annum. But that figure is being revised upwards to about $22 billion per annum. Now, GDP of Nepal is close to $30 billion in current prices. The government spends at all levels, at all three tiers, about $14–15 billion. So where is that gap coming from? It has to come from the private sector, focusing on all those SDGs which are amenable to private sector engagement. Energy, water and sanitation, urbanization, transport goals, leaving the government to focus on the more basic indicators on health and education, on gender equity, on governance, institutional quality, environmental protection, and all that. So there's a nice division of labor, if it can be demarcated, engaging the private sector. The households will have to chip in a lot, and that is factored in our overall costing. The civil society groups, the NGOs, the non-state actors will have to chip in as well. But the bulk of the SDG costs will have to be borne by the government, close to 55% of the total bill. And there, I think, once the government leads the way and gives adequate space through the right incentives again to the private sector, I think many of these goals will be met. I'm hopeful, will not be as successful as the MDGs, but this is a different game. We will try to meet most of the SDGs. Now, the implementation bottlenecks, there are many. I mean, you open a daily newspaper, you see where the problems are. The intense politicization of everything at the cost of merit-based rewards that we have in the bureaucracy, corruption, rent-seeking, and this, by the way, both the private sector and the government are in this together, the unstable series of governments that we've had, not been able to really focus very meaningfully on a mature policy cycle. So a lot of the policy initiatives that have been announced over the last 15, 20 years have had a very short span, very fickle, prone to whims, and prone to easy reversals. That doesn't do very, that doesn't translate into private promotion of private initiatives, private investments. So a lot of factors. I think we probably need an entirely different session to dissect the Nepali bureaucracy and all the implementation bottlenecks. But I did do a short report, I think a year ago, looking at the big 21 projects of national pride, so-called Rashtriya Gaurav Ka Ayojana, and we sort of distilled the implementation bottlenecks to about 4 or 5 issues at that time. First was clarity with the laws and what incentives that we give to these bigger projects on tax exemptions, foreign exchange, repatriation, and all that, all those issues. Personnel, the frequency with which they were moved around, and there the political interference was key. The availability of construction materials, actually, and there the environmental development trade-off. We really need to resolve it, and there's a big debate going on around the Nisgad airport and any other major projects. But a lot of these big Rashtriya Gaurav Ka Ayojana actually went through this issue. Big issue with contract management. We've just seen this with Melamchi that ADB funded. The Italian contractor was probably the third or the fourth to take on that task, and he ran away, literally ran away, right? And the monitoring and evaluation and this idea of really learning from our past mistakes to avoid those. So there's a whole series of issues that we can really dissect at a popular level, that is, and popularize it through newspapers in a way that laymen will understand, lay audience will understand. But also some of these issues actually lend to very rigorous academic probing as well.
Thank you, Dr. Wagle. With that, we'll end the session. I think one of the main takeaways for me is that by 2030, talking about middle income status is not enough. We've become politically stable, but that is only one of the grounds on which development can be achieved. We have to look at equality, we have to look at new opportunities, we have to look at new access and connectivity as well. We have to strengthen our public institutions, as Dr. Song has said. Change will be slow, but we have to remain optimistic. We cannot become too complacent. With that, I thank my panelists for a very invigorating discussion. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much to our moderator and our panelists for that wonderful session on Towards 2030. I think we are all very hopeful, and we look forward to what 2030 might bring in, how 10 years down the line, how Nepal might grow.
The Kantipur